first. You should know that I have risen through the fire in colorful buckskin. The object of my desire is the color of my skin.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Crim 103, week 13. It's the last proper lecture of the semester. I hope it's been a good one for all the students out there. On Canvas, you'll be able to fill out a course evaluation, and if you could do so, that would definitely be appreciated by me. Getting to know how we're doing and what we can do to improve students' learning outcomes is definitely important to me. So this week we're going to be talking about racism and anti-racism. Anti-racism is basically acting back or fighting back against racist policies, racist practices, and so on. So this doesn't have a ton to do with psychological explanations of offending, though certainly there are some parallels. For example, we'll be looking at residential school experiences of Indigenous youth and the intergenerational transmission of trauma and abuse. And I think this will highlight, for example, the learning aspects of psychological theories of crime that we've been talking about in this class. But the reason why I want to touch on this topic is especially because if we are going to study criminology, we need to also be understanding inequalities in crime and inequalities in the justice system. Back in the summer after the assassination of George Floyd, there was a social media movement called Blackout Tuesday, and one of the purposes of this movement was to get people to sit down and reflect on what they were going to do, not just to understand racism, but what they can do to be anti-racist. And so part of my goal was to create this lecture for students. I'll explain in a moment why I focus specifically on Indigenous issues for this particular lecture, but it's also kind of problematic to focus just on Indigenous issues because it's not as if Indigenous peoples are the only minority group that has been experiencing marginalization and oppression by Canada's government and Canada's people. So for example, we have around 1914 with the Kamangata Maru incident where it was a boat carrying Indian passengers. I think it may have originated from Japan actually, but it was held in the Vancouver harbor. Many people died and eventually persons were sent back to India. We have examples of the mistreatment of Chinese immigrants who came to work in Canada on the National Railway, and basically they were treated as second-class workers. They were required to do all of the dangerous activities like carrying dynamite, and this put them at risk of a lot of serious injury and even death. These persons were required to pay for their tools, and they were basically making no money on this railway despite doing some of the more dangerous work. During World War II, Vancouver and other places in Canada and the United States had internment camps where Japanese immigrants were held there based on suspicions and anti-Japanese sentiment that stemmed from World War II. During the end of the Civil War, when there was a great movement of Black Americans from the southern United States to the northern United States, there was also immigration to Canada as well. And very unfortunately, Canada's federal government viewed Black Americans coming to Canada basically the way that the previous United States government had viewed Black Americans, specifically as second-class citizens. So these are obviously really serious, really uncomfortable topics to talk about because of how horrific they are. The reason why I'm not going to be talking about all of these different injustices is because I think it's also really important to speak from a position of expertise. And I wouldn't call myself an expert in these specific aspects of Canada's history, but I'll talk a little bit about my background and why talking about Indigenous issues is something that I'm familiar with and something that is also really just important to me and something that I'm trying to grow at and get better at doing to help communicate key findings to students. Today's class will be heavily based on my reading of the Truth and Reconciliation Report, which provided 94 calls to action for basically ways that we can not just end racism, but we have to engage in anti-racist values to try to improve inequalities amongst Indigenous people or experienced by Indigenous people in Canada. The best way to do this is to bring Indigenous voices into the classroom and have them speak about these injustices. To give students a better sense of the specific people, like to put a face to the people that are experiencing these injustices and to give that person a voice and talk about the injustice experienced by their people. COVID has made it sort of more difficult to bring in guest speakers, but I also, in general, I don't like having guest speakers in my classroom because I think that it's an exploitation of their labor. Unless I can pay these guest speakers what I think they deserve, I don't think it's fair to have them come in and speak, because we're busy talking about marginalization and oppression, and I'm basically capitalizing off of somebody else's work because I'm the one that's getting paid for this lecture. And so I think it's up to me to educate myself and then pass along this knowledge to students. But it's not just education that I'm learning, from the last year or so. So I think it's important to talk a little bit about my background. So I was born and raised, well, technically I was born in Vancouver, but I was born and raised in Haida Gwaii. The medical hospital there wasn't really terrific, so my mom actually had to be helicoptered from Haida Gwaii to Vancouver for me to be born, probably more than you needed to know. So I was raised in Haida Gwaii, where the population of Haida Gwaii is approximately 50% Haida. And what was really interesting about my upbringing was that I went to school on a reserve in Skidegate, and I'll provide sort of a description of what life was like living in Haida Gwaii in a quick sort of video. But basically, while I was living in Haida Gwaii, I would go to a school on a reserve. It was very unique and very interesting because I got to, instead of learning French, they would place us in Haida education courses. So we would learn some of the language, we would learn culture, we would learn art, we would learn storytelling. And so this has exposed me from a very early age to understand the importance of Indigenous peoples being able to retain and practice their culture. All right, so I'd like to talk a little bit about why this topic on Indigenous oppression and marginalization are very important to me. So I come from Haida Gwaii, and about 50% of the population of Haida Gwaii are Haida, which is the First Nation span that has traditionally occupied those areas all the way back, I think, like 13,000 years ago. When I attended school in Haida Gwaii, I went to school on the reserve in Skidegate, and instead of learning things like French, we were taught Haida. So we would learn the language, we would learn culture, we would learn how to carve or paint the way of the traditions of the Haida people. Right now we're looking at SFU, which is on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, which include the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And we're gonna go on a little bit of a journey to see how we get to Haida Gwaii. And what's important to understand about this is that the Haida Nation would actually travel down to Vancouver and travel down to Vancouver Island by way of canoe. So this will kind of give you an extent of how far they had to travel to get to different places. So here we are at SFU, and if we go over the Ironworkers Bridge through North Vancouver, we get to West Vancouver, and from West Vancouver there's a ferry at Horseshoe Bay. We'll take across and we'll get into Nanaimo. So here we are passing through Gabriela Island to Nanaimo. Then you get to drive all the way up to the northern part of Vancouver Island to a place called Port Hardy. And at Port Hardy, you get to take a nice 18-hour ferry from Port Hardy up to Prince Rupert. So again, that's 18 hours non-stop by ferry, so just sort of think about how long that would take in canoe hours. So here you can see in that blue line there's the Inside Passage ferry, and so I'll just zoom out so you can see different things. Rivers Inlet, very popular for fishing there, Bella Bella as well, and then up in Klemtu, and if we keep going north of Hartley Bay, we're going to get to Prince Rupert, and you can see as we cross this strait here, we will get to Haida Gwaii. So you arrive from Port Hardy in Prince Rupert, you camp for the night, and then you have a 6-hour ferry from Prince Rupert into Haida Gwaii, specifically, you arrive at the First Nations Reserve of Skidegate. The nearest mall, the nearest McDonald's, the nearest movie theater, they're all a 6-hour ferry ride away to Prince Rupert. So like to give you a sense of how desperate kids were, they used to fly in like once every maybe like 3 months. They would have a plane leave from Prince Rupert and buy like 300 Big Macs from McDonald's and bring them to the school to sell. They probably sold us those Big Macs for like $73 each, but Big Macs were hard to come by over there, so that's what we would eat. So I'm going to zoom in now on Haida Gwaii. So the Haida people typically live in Masset, Old Masset, and then down here in, we're going to go right to Skidegate. And Skidegate is where the Scott Ganai Elementary School is that I attended. There's also some old sites here. The island, again, I can't remember how many people used to live in the island. It was more than 10,000. It was close to maybe like 50,000 people. By the early 1900s, especially due to smallpox, only approximately 300 people lived in all of the Haida Gwaii Islands. So that gives you an extent of the impact of colonization and genocide. So right here at the Haida Heritage Center is where they've had a lot of traditional totem pole raisings and things like that. So where the museum is. And we're about to sort of zoom in further on Skidegate just to quickly show you where the Scott Ganai Elementary School is. You can see the field there. This is where the Scott Ganai Elementary School is, which is where I went to school. And then I'll show you where I'm from. If you travel down here, we get to Queen Charlotte, which isn't actually where I lived. You can see out front of Queen Charlotte, there's this smaller island called Robertson Island. And there were about 4 families that lived on the island. And we're zooming in on my house right now. And I would have, to get to school, I would have my kayak out in the front yard there and get in the kayak, go out into the water here, and go around this side of the island and over to this point over here. And then you can dock to sort of store your kayak up on the beach. And then the secondary school or the high school is, I think it should show up. It's kind of right here. It doesn't, I don't know why Google is not behaving very well to show you where the high school is, but you can kind of see this old dirt patch. That's where the high school used to be. And then just above that is where the high school now is. So that's where I came from, that's my experience, and that's why this is a topic that is particularly important. One of the things that bothers me is how people will only refer to reserves in the negative. Without a doubt, there are problems on reserves, especially when we look at Ontario and Quebec and we learn about things about the lack of access to running water and so on. But imagine somebody comes into your home and all they do is criticize it. How would that make you feel? People are saying that they want to help, but all they're doing is telling you how bad your situation is. When I went to school on the reserve in Skidegate, the school was beautiful. You can see a picture of it in the slide, but it wasn't just the school. The Haida Nation had been doing a really good job of trying to engage in self-governance. And this included things like developing the Skidegate Haida Immersion Program, which basically was helping through elders retain the language, put language down into actual books and actual documents so that these things can be passed along to future generations. There's a growing industry of ecotourism in Haida Gwaii. There's a growing industry of art, totem carvings, filming movies about the Haida people, maintain their traditions of fishing. So this reserve was a nice place to be. Again, not to say that there weren't problems. In any community, there are always going to be problems. They're still fighting for more autonomy, but how there can be really good and positive things on reserves. And if we don't acknowledge those things, how can that negatively impact the psyche of the people who are working really hard to make these improvements? I think if we don't acknowledge their hard work and the progress that has been made, even if there are miles to go, it's not going to do any good in helping to continue to make progress. So when thinking about reserves, try to think about the people that also live there, and that if you're only talking negatively about the reserves, you're really talking negatively about somebody's home, and that might not be that conducive to helping that person. And this is not true only of Indigenous peoples. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a TEDx SFU event, and one of the speakers, as you can see pictured here in this slide, was Yabom Gilpin Jackson. And she talked about when one of her children went to school, they learned about Africa. And instead of talking about specific African nations, they talked about Africa as a whole, which can be kind of inaccurate because there's so much diversity and heterogeneity across Africa. But the message that students were given was that Africa was characterized by people who were poor and living in poverty and malnourished. And so this child came home to their mother crying because they didn't want to be African, because everybody was telling them that to be African was to be poor and to be impoverished. So we really have to think about when we use these terms and we're trying to recognize injustice or recognize problems, but how does we can recognize these problems in a more sensitive way that is going to be more humane and sort of still helping to empower people as opposed to further disenfranchise them. So earlier I talked about the importance of elevating Indigenous voices, and I would love to have Bob Joseph be able to come into the classroom and talk about his book. I have it here for anybody that's interested. It's not very expensive at all. You can get it on Amazon. It'll get here in a day, and it's a really important book to read. It's quite short, but it can take you a while to actually read it because you'll read some sentences and they will just sort of blow your mind. Like, you cannot understand, like, is that really what Canada did? Because some of these sentences are just so shocking. So ideally we would have Mr. Joseph come in and talk about this book, but I don't want to do that without being able to pay him what he deserves, and I just don't have the money to do so. So what I've done is I've taken 12 of the things that you may not know about the Indian Act. So he wrote on 21 of them. I encourage you to be able to buy the book and follow up and read the other 9 things. The reason why I'm focusing on 12 is because I don't want to skim over all 21. I want to take some time to describe each of these 12 things that I'm going to be talking about and how they have impacted Indigenous peoples in Canada. So this Indian Act still exists today. It has changed a lot, and it no longer includes the 12 things that I'm going to be talking about, but by talking about them, it will give you a better understanding about what life was like for Indigenous peoples in Canada, especially from around the late 1800s, which is when the Indian Act was created, and the mid 1900s, especially around like 1951 was when a lot of these things began to be repealed, but it took certainly a long period of time for this to happen. Before we get started, just to cover a couple of key terms and definitions. So when I'm using the term Indigenous peoples, this is the preferred term to describe persons that come from a First Nations, Métis, or Inuit background. First Nations does not describe all Indigenous people in Canada. Another misconception, and we'll talk about this when we review Mr. Joseph's book, is the relationship between Indigenous peoples and reserves. Very often there's this misconception that a reserve is a traditional territory of a First Nations band, for example. But as you can see in this slide here, a reserve is actually just a tract of land, the legal title to which is basically belonging to the Queen. Basically back then would be England, now Canada. Basically set aside by Canada for Indigenous peoples, but it's not necessarily their actual territory or their actual land. And before beginning with the 12 problems that you may not know about the Indian Act, one of the things that we need to talk about is when is a term Indian appropriate to use? And the short answer is basically never. Very rarely is it ever appropriate to use this term, but Mr. Joseph will outline in his book several instances in which it may be necessary to use the term. One is when you're making direct quotes, especially in terms of how Canada has referred to Indigenous peoples in the past, when it comes to citing previous literature, art, and so on, when it comes to discussions of history, and that can very much go in tandem with direct quotes. There's also a legal or constitutional meaning behind the term Indian, in particular when referring to a person's status as a status Indian and the rights or benefits they may be entitled to under different treaties. So the first thing that you may not know about the Indian Act, according to Mr. Joseph, is that the Band Council in Chief system that exists today, it wasn't a system that was passed down from generation to generation of Indigenous person. This was a system forced upon Indigenous people based on colonizers' desire to have Indigenous peoples' culture look more like traditional Euro-based examples of political systems. That Indigenous peoples were allowed to have a chief and create a band council was not an indication that they were allowed to have autonomy. The reason why these systems were created was simply to facilitate communication between a First Nations band, for example, and an Indian agent. So an Indian agent was typically a white person placed in this position of power by the government to communicate with different Indigenous peoples. And the Indian agent would obviously only speak English. So the First Nations band, for example, would elect a chief very often based on their ability to communicate with the Indian agent. So the person had to be able to speak English as opposed to a person who necessarily had more of the best interests of the nation in the back of their mind, or who was more well equipped to handle the political side of things. Another problem was that the Indian Act forced chiefs to be elected every 2 years. We see this problem in Canadian government as well, where if you force somebody to be in their position for just 2 years, they tend to be forced to think only about short-term goals because they have to accomplish goals in quick succession in order to justify their re-election. If individuals were allowed to be in these positions for a longer period of time, then they could think about the long term, which might be in the better interests of the nation as a whole. What's also important to mention is that Indigenous cultures have a very strong presence of women in key political roles. We have Haida matriarchs who are there to help make decisions that are in the best long-term interests of the Haida Nation and respect and bring in and continue to maintain the cultures and traditions. You'll see these matriarchs were on the news back in the summer when tourists and fishing lodges were trying to travel to Haida Gwaii, and the matriarch stood up and said, no, this is not what we're doing. We're not a tourist destination right now because it's not in the best long-term interests of the health of the Haida people and the people living in Haida Gwaii. But with the new election system that was created by colonizers, effectively women were not allowed to vote in these systems until the 1950s, and were not actually allowed to vote in any federal election in Canada until the 1960s. The second thing that you may not know about the Indian Act ties into the first thing, which is that women were very regularly denied status. So prior to colonization, there was much more equality amongst men and women in Indigenous cultures. However, the Indian Act imposed specific rules, one of which was that if an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous person, then she would be no longer considered Indian, meaning she would no longer be eligible to, for example, monies that were owed due to treaty agreements and sales of land and so on. If an Indigenous woman married a person outside of her own band or First Nations group, then they would no longer be eligible to any of the benefits that that initial Indigenous group were receiving. Children who were born of the Indigenous woman who married a non-Indigenous man would no longer be considered Indigenous. So many of these children lost their Indian status and they weren't eligible for treaty agreements. And very importantly, when we look at the third thing that you may not know about the Indian Act with respect to the creation of reserves, reserves were not created as a way to return traditional territories to Indigenous peoples. These were simply areas that were reserved for, quote, Indians, unquote. So in the Indian Act, these reserves were a way to separate Indigenous peoples from white settlers. And this is why I think that although on paper the government regularly talked about the value of assimilation of Indigenous peoples into white culture, if you look at the actual practices, how can you say that you are trying to assimilate Indigenous peoples when you are effectively kicking them off of valued land and then giving them land separate from European settlers. Basically, to me, it was more close to genocide, where the practice was to try and isolate indigenous peoples from valuable tracts of land. So basically, the land that indigenous peoples traditionally occupied would often be very valuable land for things like farming, for agriculture, for, in this case, for European settlers wanting to build a railway. The valuable land was taken and then indigenous peoples were placed on reserves that didn't necessarily equate to the scope, like how much land or the value of that land in terms of its value for farming and so on. And still today, if you look at the article here from The Guardian, we'll learn that the indigenous reserves are very often still owned by the federal government, not indigenous peoples. Another thing that you may not know about the Indian Act is that indigenous peoples were encouraged to give up their status as a status Indian in order to be eligible to vote. So basically, the government did not want to be paying individuals the money that they were owed for land sales and so on. So indigenous peoples were encouraged by the Indian agent to give up their status so that they would be allowed to vote in federal elections. What this also did was help to sort of create this divide and conquer goal, which was we can begin to separate indigenous persons by having some give up their status and some not give up their status, and maybe that will cause a rift between the two groups or cultural isolation and help to further drive a wedge between indigenous peoples, because we'll see throughout the description of Mr. Joseph's book, one of the goals was to not have indigenous people have the ability or opportunity to form political groups or band together as a way to recognize and get payback for injustices. So when I was reading the book, I think this aspect of the Indian Act was the one that was most surprising to me. So the number 5 thing that you may not know about the Indian Act was the expropriation of reserves. And I said number 5, this wasn't meant to rank them. This is just the order in which they were listed in Mr. Joseph's book. The expropriation of reserves allowed the government to essentially, when it suited them or when it was in the public interest, kick indigenous peoples off of the reserve that had been given to them if, for example, that reserve contained valuable land, or this was one that really surprised me, was that if the indigenous reserve was encroaching too closely to a city of 8,000 people or more, then the government right away was allowed to move that reserve further away from that city. So again, how is this any evidence that the goal was assimilation? If you are basically saying that, oh, you're getting too close to white settlers, so we're going to move you further and further away. Again, I think this is more evidence that the goal was cultural genocide and true genocide, as opposed to actually trying to do anything to find a way to bring both groups together. When indigenous peoples were moved off of these reserves and onto new reserves, they were compensated for this. But here's the crazy part, is the person that represented the indigenous group was the Indian agent. And so the Indian agent is basically somebody from the government, and so the government is effectively negotiating against itself. So the Indian agent isn't necessarily going to be trying to get the best deal for indigenous persons. Really, they're just going to want to keep their job, so they're not going to want to make the government upset. You might say, well, couldn't indigenous peoples do anything about this, like get a lawyer? And the answer is no. One of the things that I'm not going to talk about today, but it's in Mr. Joseph's book, is that indigenous peoples were not allowed to actually retain the services of a lawyer. So lawyers were not allowed to act on behalf of indigenous peoples. So this was, again, one of those ways that the government was able to negotiate in bad faith and do some of these despicable things. Another thing that you may not know about the Indian Act is the assigning of European surnames to indigenous peoples, and also Christian names as well. So you may think maybe an indigenous person selected this last name. So Bob Joseph says, like, we did not select the surname Joseph. The Indian agent would very regularly just give an indigenous person his first name as the indigenous person's new last name. So Joseph was probably just some guy named Joe that acted as an Indian agent. Bob Joseph is talked about and makes a joke in the book about how there are a lot of Josephs out there, but they're not related. They just maybe have the same Indian agent. That's the only common connection between the two of them. Basically, the Indian agent was responsible for creating a registry of indigenous peoples to figure out who was owed money from land agreements. But indigenous names were sometimes difficult to pronounce, and at other times, indigenous people did not just have one name. They would have multiple names for different stages of their life or to be used in different contexts and so on. Basically, these names were ignored, and persons who were of status, had Indian status, were just assigned a surname. Another example of why it does not seem like there was ever a goal of helping to assimilate, not to say that assimilation was a good thing, but assimilation is at least less severe than genocide. But the reason why, again, I don't think there was evidence of goals of assimilation is because indigenous peoples were also denied the ability to freely sell livestock or freely sell crops that were grown on reserves. They had to get permission from the Indian agent to sell these things. And the reason why this permission was required was because the government wanted to encourage people to immigrate from Europe, and they didn't want these new European immigrants to have to compete with indigenous peoples for the sale of crops and livestock. This was the goal of trying to prevent indigenous peoples from participating in the wage economy so that it wouldn't threaten the ability of white people to participate in this wage economy. They also prohibited indigenous peoples from being allowed to buy farming equipment. And very often, remember, these reserves were set aside for indigenous peoples because the land that they had traditionally occupied was valuable farming land. So they were often moved to reserves, maybe because that land was not seen as particularly useful for farming in the first place, or for growing livestock and so on. If indigenous peoples had difficulty farming the land, they might try to group together to buy certain machinery to facilitate farming. But indigenous peoples, once again, were not allowed to do this. They weren't allowed to buy farming equipment as a group. And the argument that was made was that we do not, so this is the government speaking, saying that we do not want indigenous peoples to participate in like community or collective cultures. We want that individualistic perspective to be infiltrated into indigenous cultures. And so I think that this was not necessarily done because the government truly wanted to promote capitalistic values amongst indigenous peoples. I think it was just wanting to further oppress and marginalize indigenous peoples. Eighth thing that you may not know about the Indian Act, which is something that might make people in the United States really raise their eyebrows, is that the Indian Act prohibited the sale of ammunition to indigenous peoples. And one of the reasons for this was to try to prevent any rebellion from taking place, or basically not allow indigenous peoples to ever fight back against injustices against them. So the indigenous person could be convicted of a crime, and the person selling ammunition to an indigenous person could be convicted of a crime. The ninth thing that you may not know about the Indian Act is that it prohibited the sale of alcohol to indigenous peoples. And this was never because the government thought that indigenous peoples had a drinking problem or anything like that. This was because the government did not want indigenous people engaging in acts of leisure. They wanted indigenous peoples basically to just work all the time. They did not want indigenous people to be partaking in the same acts that white people were partaking in, especially in terms of the fact that indigenous people were also banned from drinking establishments. Essentially, what happened was, because indigenous peoples were banned from drinking establishments or were not allowed to drink alcohol in general, what happened was they wanted to have a drink. They usually had to do so in back alleys, and they had to do so very quickly so as to not be detected by law enforcement. And so this stereotype that indigenous peoples have problems with alcohol is kind of a mischaracterization, in that Part of the reason why they were drinking alcohol and maybe appeared to be drunk was because they were forced to drink alcohol so quickly because it was banned for them but not banned for other peoples. And this included during World War II when indigenous peoples helped fight against Nazi Germany alongside fellow Canadians. Indigenous peoples returning from the war were banned from veterans' legions. There was often in these legions different networking opportunities, different opportunities to go into business together, events being put on to honor these former soldiers or continuing soldiers. And Indigenous veterans were banned from being able to attend these ceremonies or these practices. And so basically what it's saying is that an Indigenous person is free to go and fight and die alongside European persons, but when they get back to Canada, they're not allowed to share a drink with European persons. The 10th thing that you may not know about the Indian Act is how it banned potlatches. And this is an especially common practice amongst coastal First Nations groups. So when I grew up in Haida Gwaii, my family were sometimes invited to go to these potlatches, and it basically involves a lot of different things. It's not just the food, although the food is terrific, and there's examples of storytelling, singing, dancing, or naming. It's a very important ceremony to Haida people. These ceremonies were taken away from the Haida and other coastal First Nation groups because the government did not want these persons to be able to continue to practice their culture. And the reason why this was so damning to these particular indigenous cultures is because they had very rich oral traditions and oral history. This is how they would communicate their stories and their experiences, not just writing in books or newspapers. It was having these potlatches to communicate stories and tradition. And so this was a way to try and, from the government's perspective, eradicate these traditions and these cultures. So if potlatches were being held, law enforcement would go in and they would take away the cultural artifacts associated with these ceremonies. So these monuments were basically stolen from different indigenous cultures and then sent to museums around the world, where it's basically really difficult for indigenous peoples to ever get these monuments and important pieces of culture back. The 11th thing that you may not know about the Indian Act is that it made it illegal for indigenous peoples to leave the reserve without the permission of the Indian agent. And the thing is that the Indian agent didn't live on the reserve. They sometimes lived basically like a day or two walk away from the indigenous reserve. Indigenous peoples, if they wanted to leave the reserve, would have to walk a day or two camping overnight to get to the Indian agent's house. And sometimes the Indian agent wouldn't even be there because they're out to other reserves. And so they could have to camp overnight again, waiting for the Indian agent and not knowing if they were even going to get permission to actually leave the reserve. And permission to leave the reserve was needed to even, for example, go and see children who are living off reserve at a residential school. And again, how is this an example of a goal of assimilation? Remembering that assimilation is not an okay practice either, but this isn't even an assimilation goal. This is an eradication goal where you're basically saying, do not come and visit us. You stay here, we don't want anything to do with you, and we're going to make your conditions very, very negative and effectively result in death. In Mr. Joseph's book, the 12th thing that he mentions that you may not know about the Indian Act are residential schools. I think most students, especially if you went to elementary and secondary school in Canada, should have been exposed to the atrocities associated with residential schools that ran from the late 1800s all the way up until 1996. These weren't things that are just historical experiences that go back hundreds of years ago. These were things that happened around the time that students in this class were being born. This was clearly the most aggressive and destructive policy of all the different policies in the Indian Act. And it was very clear, like statements from Canadian prime ministers, Duncan Campbell, who was one of the persons responsible for administering the Indian Act, basically saying that the goal is to kill the Indian in the child. They were trying to get rid of all of the cultural experiences of Indigenous kids by moving them off reserves and onto separate land. And the idea was, from the perspective of government, that they were going to separate children from the parents so that there could be no influence of the parents in the attempt to assimilate these children. But the way they presented it to Indigenous parents was the idea that by sending their kids to these schools, it would be a benefit to them because they were going to become educated, and that would allow them to participate in the wage economy. So remember how we talked about divide and conquer? Well, here's another example of they're telling parents one thing to give them the perception that this would be in the best interest of their children. And when their children go to these schools, they experience such horrific experiences, but they reflect on, why did my parents send me here to begin with? Well, the parent was lied to full on, but the kid might be thinking like, does my parent love me for sending me here? My parent must hate me. And again, this can create these difficult rifts between families. We'll see some examples of this as well by prohibiting Indigenous kids from speaking their language while at residential schools. Some of the minor forms of abuse would be hitting the kid with the ruler and so on, but there were examples of Indigenous kids having their tongue pierced by a needle if they were speaking their mother tongue. When they would go home for Christmas and things like that, they'd be sent home. Actually, they wouldn't be sent home. The Indigenous parent would have to come pick up their child and then return to the reserve where they were living. And when they're living at home with their parents, they might be experiencing the trauma of having spoken their language and experienced severe physical victimization. So they don't want to speak their language to their parents, but their parents want to pass down traditions and their history. So the child doesn't want to hear the parent speak, the child doesn't want to speak to the parent, and the parent might not know English. So this is that severing of culture. But what it can also do is change the parents' ability to parent. These children were stolen from them, and so their opportunity to learn parenting skills never developed, and so they don't get to pass those parenting skills down to their own children. So for example, I have a child and they were misbehaving. I can think about, what did my parents do when my child was misbehaving? Or what did my parents do when I was succeeding? How did my parents react? So I can use this past experience to inform how I act. But these opportunities were stolen from Indigenous kids and their parents by separating these individuals for long periods of time so that these skills could not actually be passed down. So when it was all finished, somewhere between 6,000 and 150,000 children died or were misplaced or lost during the period in which residential schools were operating. This is such a wide gap in the number because residential schools didn't even really bother to record who was actually attending these residential schools. The residential schools themselves were of horrific quality, and many kids would be diagnosed with tuberculosis and would eventually die, or they would die from freezing or malnutrition, or influenza also was very prominent in these residential schools. And so about halfway through the period of residential schools, there was an effort to improve the quality of residential schools by the federal government. But it wasn't using the federal government's money to try and improve these residential schools. What the government did was the money that was owed to Indigenous peoples for land agreements and so on was taken from them and used to pay for these schools. So essentially, Indigenous kids were paying money to experience physical abuse and sexual abuse and death. And so when we look at the consequences of residential schools and we compare them to the consequences of serving in World War II, the odds of dying at a residential school was higher than the odds of dying while fighting in World War II, just to give people a sense of how catastrophic these residential schools actually were. And as I mentioned, it's important to give Indigenous persons voices. And so one of the videos that we're going to watch now is about describing the experience of residential schools.
I got frightened when I was a little girl when the principal used to beat up the other children, like boys, the boys got the most beating. They used to call it bench party, and it was usually done after supper. And that's where I got frightened, because I saw blood.
I remember when we had to shower. You only have to show me how to shower and clean and wash myself, how to wash my private and private parts of your body. You only have to show a kid once or twice at the most, but not every day. And have the supervisor come in there and basically take advantage of you.
I just remember arriving there and donning new clothes and, of course, getting a haircut and sitting in a classroom and being with other girls and witnessing my brother get punched by the supervisor.
My name is Alice Little Deer. I'm 78 years old. I spent about 8 years in residential school.
My name is Raymond Mason. I'm 62 years old, and I attended residential school for 12 years.
I'm Madeline Dion Stout. I'm 62 years old. I'm from the Kihiwan First Nation in Alberta. I attended Blue Quills Residential School for 36 consecutive months. That would be 3 years.
In order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people may say that this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. A federal cabinet minister, 1883.
I remember them taking me away from my mother and my stepfather. And I can hear them telling my mom that that was the best thing for me, and that not to worry, I would be looked after.
Our parents didn't want to worry us unduly and tell us and warn us that we are going to be separated for a long, long time with barely a visit.
I see him come around, Indian agent, in a boat with the principal, then collect some children from the reserve. Mm-hmm. Then he would come back again, come and take some more.
So the next day, I woke up with hundreds of total strangers, my size, my age, and not knowing, what are they doing with all of us here? Why are there's so many of us here, and that's where a lot of my whole life really started to change, because I got strapped, I got beaten up for speaking my own native tongue. I even had my tongue pulled out and pinched,
My strongest memory there is when the little girl died beside me. She must have been about 6. I was scared why the parents were not there. That's what I was scared about. And I knew they wouldn't feel comfortable for not being there when their daughter is dying.
And do you know why they weren't there?
They were never notified.
Indian children in the residential schools die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs.
At that time, they never told us that our sisters were across the hallway. And I didn't know that for the longest time. Then I spotted my sister, Nora, and I was so glad and so hysteric, and I went running to her and I reached out to her, and just hugged her, and I was just shaking, and terrified. And I was wondering why she was pushing me away. I didn't realize that we weren't supposed to know that we both lived in the same place, and we weren't allowed to speak to each other. We weren't allowed to talk to each other. And I can remember the principal grabbing a hold of me by the hand, and I was jumping off the floor like that, and he stripped me. And he started whacking me with a long webbed strap. He was setting an example that, if you do this, is what's going to happen to you. And all the other boys are watching, and the girls were still going through,
Their education must consist not merely training of the mind, but of a weaning from the habits and feelings of their ancestors and the acquirements of the language, art, and customs of civilized life. Edgerton Ryerson, 1847 Report for Indian Affairs.
Visits from my parents were very rare, but I do recall one visit when my mother and father came, and I remember specifically my mother's red tam, that splash of color. I remember her getting out of the wagon, and I was crying already watching them because I was missing them already. They hadn't even walked through the door yet of the residential school, but I was missing them already. And when they were actually leaving, I cried until my nose bled.
And you learn pretty quick after getting those kind of beatings. Not strapping, it's literally beatings, And ever since that day, I tried to run away. And I made friends with a guy by the name of Donald Atkinson from Rosa River First Nation. And we planned, to take off. And when we got caught, we paid for dearly, Not only did the RCMP give us a licking, but the bigger boys that was helping them chase us down.
Were you angry at your parents that they made you go to school?
Sometimes I would think about them. I get mad for all giving me here, sending me over there where all the bad treatment is. And
Tell me how you felt when you saw your children go to that school.
well, I felt sad. My first two boys went, and then a couple of years after, the next two boys went, and so on, as they got older, yeah. I told them to be strong. I had always told them to be strong, to be able to take it like the other children.
So you sent 11 kids to residential school?
Mm-hmm.
How many of them do you think were strong through that?
None of them. None of them.
What about your children? How do you think it affected them being in residential
Well,
school?
like I said, a little bit crazier than before they went to school. Their mind was a little bit more intact, staying at home with us. They knew how to hunt ducks, and they knew how to fish, and they knew how to snare rabbits and pick blueberries. Today you don't see that.
And you think that's the school?
Yeah. Everything destroyed in our world. Mm-hmm. We didn't bother white people. White people bothered me.
Indian culture is a contradiction in terms. They are uncivilized. The aim of education is to destroy the Indian. Nicholas Flood David Report, 1879.
There are three reasons why I think residential schools are a blot on the Canadian landscape. One is that we became strangers in our home and native land. Two is that nurturing relationships between parents and children were severed. Residential schools were a frontal attack on parenthood. Three is that it added to our mental stress in a very real way.
My name is Michael Loft. I'm from Ganawagi. I'm 55 years old, okay, and my dad attended residential school for 11 continuous years in Spanish, Ontario. He says, and once he told me a story where they were so bored, they were in the cafeteria, and they would just walk in a circle, because they couldn't just go run around, willy-nilly all over the residential school just because school was out. They had to be controlled, I guess, had to be contained, and so they would walk in circles, in the cafeteria, round and round and round and round, to deal with their boredom.
My name's Lorena Fontaine. I'm 38 years old, and both my parents and grandparents went to residential school. I was at a conference that my mom was speaking at. She was giving the keynote address, and she started talking about her residential school experience during her speech. And and that's how I found out. Well, I was, of course, I was shocked and appalled, and I just felt so terrible for her. I felt frozen when I was listening to her. And it wasn't until after she finished speaking that I started thinking about our family life. I started thinking about the abuse that was very prevalent when I was a child. And I started putting connections together.
He never knew when he was going to get hit in residential school. That's the thing. So he lived like in fear of getting hit. You break a rule, you get whacked, So it was unpredictable. You couldn't. You could try to learn the rules as best as you could, but I mean, you're a kid. You'd mess up and whack. So there was that unpredictability that he brought home too, and the same thing with us. We didn't know what was going to happen. Next. So it was scary.
I was raised by parents who never had a childhood, and they didn't have any parents as role models. So we were vulnerable children, and a lot of us were abused ourselves as young children. And I also realized at that point that one of the people who abused me in my family had been a residential school survivor, a family member, and I understood why now, why I was abused.
The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and to assimilate the Indian people in all respects. Sir John A. Macdonald, May 2nd, 1887.
He got out, like everybody gets out at 16, and he eventually made his way to Aguizasne, to his home, and he told me that he couldn't connect with them. He couldn't connect because he couldn't speak the language. He didn't understand the culture. So he couldn't take it, He was frustrated. He was going nowhere. So he went back to the residential school for one more year because it seemed like that was home now. That was home. And that's where he could, they spoke his language, and so that's where he went.
I grew up not knowing my language, and in fact, I kind of felt a bit ashamed about our language and our identity because it seemed like they were, meaning my parents and my aunts and uncles, were ashamed too in some way because they didn't want to talk about it and they didn't want to share with us about who we were.
There was a lot of fear. I think the fear that they put in him, the terror that they put in him. I mean, he managed to bring that with him, and it went into our family, you know. And I learned terror and fear and all that as well as a child. I put fear in my sons too. That's all I knew, you know. When they were doing something that was right, I would put fear in them, you know.
Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, January 1st, 1920.
Generally, the survivors of residential school do not commit suicide any more than the general population. Okay. It's the children of the residential school survivors who commit suicide in incredibly high numbers. You know, 6 to 7 times, you know, the provincial average. Okay.
It might just take one person to start talking about it, or perhaps a family to start talking about the fact that there is abuse, and the reason why there's that abuse is because of the residential school experience. That, you know, we're not abusive people by trade. We're not, we weren't born that way. And to be able to, I think families need to be able to realize that they're not alone, that none of us are alone anymore, that we have each other, and that it's okay to start talking about it.
We don't have the monopoly on pain and hurt, but we have and have carried a disproportionate share of it over time. And I would really like us to move forward, not to erase our memory of who we are, because residential school is certainly a part of who we are. I'd like us all to be a part of a team that really makes a lasting difference for not only residential school survivors, but the other little children who are having difficulties today.
These residential schools weren't just something that was popularized in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then slowly dissipated. In the 1960s, about 20,000 children were taken from their families and fostered into the homes or adopted into the homes of white European, Canadians, Americans, and even kids, Indigenous kids, were fostered into homes in Europe. Parents would very often not even know where their children actually ended up. So to give you a sense of the number of kids, imagine you go to work and then you are driving home and you live in Coquitlam and you arrive in Coquitlam and every single kid aged 0 to 9 is no longer there. So there are about 20,000 kids between the ages of 0 and 9 in Coquitlam. And basically all of these individuals would suddenly be removed. So you can think about, just from the sheer number, about how weird that would be if you're driving by schools or you're driving by daycares, shopping malls, grocery stores, and so on, to never see somebody who is a child. So again, think about how this can impact Indigenous persons in terms of not just, it's clear that there's trauma, there's abuse, but also the experience of not growing up with a family and passing down traditions and values, ways of being a parent, ways of working, and so on. So we see quite clearly the negative results of the attempted genocide against Indigenous peoples that include poorer educational outcomes, overrepresentation in foster care, overrepresentation in the justice system, a lower median income compared to other Canadians, more likely to experience early mortality and substance abuse, and more likely to experience suicide or suicidal ideation. So we need to be working towards addressing these inequalities. These inequalities were created because of this history of oppression and marginalization. The Indian Act still exists, though the 12 things that I've talked about are no longer part of the Indian Act, but it still illustrates the difficulty in finding a way for giving Indigenous peoples back the right to self-governance. The right to self-governance doesn't mean you get to make laws and we get to comment on whether they're going to be valid or not. A right is something that you are entitled to. So it's not a choice of whether you think this is a good decision or not. If it's somebody's right, it's unquestionable whether or not they're allowed to do it. So this is the racist part of Canada's history. How do we create the anti-racist part of Canada's history? And I think this starts with addressing this inequality, and we have questions about, okay, so what is the first step? What do we actually do to address this inequality? I think step one is to just listen, which means to find books like this. There's another book called The Inconvenient Indian that students should definitely read. And then listening through paying attention to the specific needs of specific First Nations groups. It's not fair to treat all Indigenous peoples as this homogenous group. They come from different cultures, different backgrounds, different traditions. So listening to the specific needs of specific groups is important, which is why now we'll watch a brief video about persons from Haida Gwaii describing their culture and what their goals are for the future.
Historically, life was very precarious here. Everything had to be balanced for life to carry on. My ancestors used the phrase, the world is like living on the edge of a knife. You have to walk carefully, you have to walk in balance or you fall off the edge of the earth, literally.
People, they think it's, the wild frontiers, and they want to come here and just take. So that's what has to change here. People have to realize that we can't just continue taking.
And we have so much integrity built into this journey, like it's 30 years since the Stand at Lyle. And I think by telling that story, to young people and getting them to kind of embrace that dark chapter, I think you have to know where we come from in order to really come out of it. Because it's an amazing story.
When I imagine life in that time period, I think of it as a completely different existence. It would be a joyful time arriving into the village and seeing the grandeur of the longhouses that we don't see today and the totem poles, and it was certainly a wilder and more colorful existence. Of course, there were hundreds of villages before contact. The thought was that the first explorers were coming from the spirit world. And there was a lot of respect paid, and of course ceremonies and spreading eagle down on the water and the headdress ceremonies to show that we were greeting them in peace as well. But that, of course, wasn't who arrived. They weren't people from the spirit world, and it was a whole unfolding of colonization as we've experienced everywhere in the world. The smallpox epidemics hit so quickly that a lot of the elders said that there wasn't time to bury the people who were dying. They were dying so quickly.
It was a very, obviously a difficult emotional time and a lot of loss, and it was a time when raising of poles and practicing other cultural events was actually being discouraged. Probably the last pole to be raised in Guayana was over 130 years ago. So we haven't seen any recent pole raisings in Guayana.
And I think that in some ways we did collapse. With all of the impacts of colonization and the epidemics, our society and our structure and our culture collapsed. I wouldn't say it was a complete collapse, but a partial collapse, because there was this complete assault on who we were as a people, our place in the world.
So we went from a real proud people to a very desperate people, really. It's something I've been doing for over 35 years. Gotta follow the traditional steps, really. Like our ancestors, they would probably carve it in 3 months or so. Without any aids of any pencils and paper. And, they would just visualize it in there and just divide out all the sections and maybe use a piece of charcoal. And so, okay, I'm gonna cut it here, I'm gonna cut it here. The way I create my work is through my mind, really. It just comes to me, really. I go through the stories for inspiration.
The rules with which they drew lines are so beautiful. The word that comes to mind more than anything when it comes to Haida artwork and Haida values is respect. It's about respecting the ancestors and the art that they created. Everything is really about respect. This particular piece is called Salmon Dance. It is believed that all creatures, in particular supernatural beings, were like human beings underneath their skin. Really leads into the thought that all creatures on this earth are equal to us. We're not any more important than the fish or the whales or the herring.
I've heard many stories of the interaction with the supernatural beings, and that today the curtain that separates us from the supernatural beings has become thicker, so it's harder to go there. So in that time, the curtain between us and the difference between our realms was very thin.
The supernatural beings do not like to be trampled upon. They're going to cause mankind some problems if we keep on abusing our earth, really.
By quantifying nature, it's how much we can get out of it, how quickly we can get that into our bank accounts instead of having nature renew itself. It feels like the world is getting out of balance, and that is a great cause of concern, and that's really out of lack of respect.
In British Columbia, a dispute over the future of a wilderness area in the Queen Charlotte Islands has led to a confrontation. The loggers and the Indians have been negotiating unsuccessfully for the past 12 years. This week, a group of Haida Indians began obstructing the passage of logging crews into the South Moresby area.
These trees used to be plentiful all along the coast. Today, the Queen Charlotte Islands are the last mother lode of this green gold. Last Wednesday morning, a group of Haida came to Sedgwick Bay on Lyle Island to protect this lifestyle.
You're breaking the law, and you're stopping us from going to work, and we ask you to step aside and let us continue.
There will be no logging on the area that the Haida people have designated as not to be touched. This is Haida land, and there'll be no further logging in this area.
We all seen the videos of, the stand at Lyle. They did what they thought was right. They didn't bank on anybody caring or internationally community, rising up to stand beside them. They just went out to take a stand because they had enough.
These are our homelands. Exploitation of resources and in the management of these islands that the people who are here sharing these lands with us respect equally with everyone else the aspirations and the values of the Haida Nation. We've been here for thousands of years. We intend to be here for thousands more.
There came a point when we saw the extent of the devastation and knew that we had to stop. Diane Brown has talked about how if that didn't happen when it did, that it would have affected the future of the whole earth, not just Haida Gwaii, but everywhere, that it was a fork in the road, that if we didn't do what we did, then it would have affected everyone on the earth and our balance with the earth.
And it's not just a one-sided story either. One of the elders there, Fussy Marks, has his legendary quote of saying, we're not just doing this for us. We're doing this for, what at the time he called the white people. Well, what are they going to log? Just like that simplicity of saying, look, this is not just about the Haida people. At the end of the day, that's what the fight is for. It's for everybody that respects this island and wants to call it home, and for forever.
Lyle Island wasn't just a blockade, it wasn't just a standoff, it was an exercise of our laws. The laws that are embedded in our culture that say we must protect this earth, we must protect the land, and we've got to find a better balance for how we live with the earth.
That event got national and international attention and resulted in the province of British Columbia and the federal government coming together and signing what we call the South Moresby Agreement. More than 20 years after its signing, it's still talked about as an agreement before its time.
Under the dual authorities, both governments create and implement their own law.
If you look at the first page of that agreement, it's a disagreement. It's an agreement to disagree, and the Haida are very clear that this is Haida land. The federal government is very clear this is Canada's land, and both parties agree to respect those opposing views and come together and work together.
It's a model that is beyond consultation and accommodation and getting consent, because we're jointly working together to find a solution. At its heart, it's reconciliation. It's finding a way to bring us together. For some Haida people, they have a tough time with that because they don't like the idea of sharing, considering that dark chapter. Some people say, why don't share with anybody when we got treated a certain way? But our elders taught us different. They said, that's how you feel, but that's not the right answer. The right answer is to coexist with our neighbor. That's the roots of everything.
We raised the Gwaii Legacy Pole in 2013 to celebrate the relationship that we had. It tells the story of Gwaii right from the beginning of time up until today. It incorporates a number of different images that represent different periods of time and tells the stories.
Okay, you guys ready? 10, 1, 2, 3, heave! Off on that side. Okay, we're good. Keep going. Easy. Easy.
To have a pole up to commemorate, how far we've come. It's kind of mind-boggling to think, what can happen in 30 years. Because in that 30-year period, we've done an unbelievable amount of things that's now kind of coming into context about how groundbreaking it all was. And now we're looking in the water, we're looking for the same approach. We're looking for equal say in how you treat the waters of Haida Gwaii, including the resources within them. We're talking about fish.
One of the biggest problems on the coast right now is with the herring fishery because of basically the lack of herring.
Herring and others are indicator species, but they're also cultural keystone species. You will see herring and salmon and cedar and other important resources like that throughout, mentioned many, many, many times throughout stories. And we know from that that they are really important beings that we need to protect.
Herring are the signal of the food season in terms of the ocean. It's the first moment at which we stop eating from our freezers and we start eating from the ocean again. And I think everybody who lives on Haida Gwaii can appreciate coming out of the spring and the herring arriving, returning, is a signal for that.
Our concern around herring is that it's been closed for 10 years, and that's not necessarily the Haida shutting it down. It's, DFO shut down herring fishery because it collapsed. We were pretty happy that it was shut down for the last 10 years because we just believe it hasn't recovered. And I think it was starting to show maybe some optimism that it was going to come back, but wasn't anywhere close to being opened.
Herring are one of the main diets of spring salmon, which is very, very important to our diet, but it's also the diet for a lot of the killer whales. It just shows that anything that feed on herring are in jeopardy as it goes up, the food web.
So we just started asking ourselves the question, well, why? Like, why are they opening the herring fishery when they know, even the science of the time says, it's not ready?
The commercial fishery has always been like gambling in a way, I think. And that's what's going on really, is they're gambling with a resource and hoping that it's going to turn out all right. Maybe that's part of their job, is to make educated guess. But if they don't get it right, then they don't have any, there's nobody responsible.
It should be an easy way for us to reach a solution together because the sustainability issues are clear.
So that's kind of the root of the conflict, is DFO opens it, Haida Nation said it's still closed, so what happens? It's going down this path where herring could potentially be the Lyle Island, on the water, where we're saying enough is enough. Like, you can't continue to wipe out species that the Haida depend on with zero consequences.
Balance is about sustainability. We know that life on Earth is always changing, but on the other hand, our place on this earth should be about keeping balance and not taking more than we need, and also taking so much that the other creatures can't sustain themselves.
And that's really what it's all about. I mean, is trying to create this balance, right? So I think that's what we're starting to do slowly. And there's a lot of pressure on ensuring that the integrity is always there, but it's just such a different world today. But we have that history to rely on the values and principles that we got to uphold in this. It does us well. I mean, that history has so much application in today, when we're sitting down with government or with industry and, looking back at the Haida Gwaii story, I think people do, treat us a little bit different here because, it's not just talk, we've walked that journey, and, you have to be able to continue that in a modern setting.
We are the stories we tell. And the whole history of colonization has been one of a taking and of the government unilaterally making decisions about everything, really, even our day-to-day life. And so with that comes a sort of a attitude or sense of dependency and victim. And so as we've taken steps in asserting our laws over the landscape and fulfilling our responsibilities, we see less of that attitude in the younger generation who didn't have to face that same history, who didn't have to face what our elders went through. And so they have a completely different story that they see. They see a history where we have power and words mean something, and the actions, when we say no more, then we mean no more, and we will do whatever it takes to protect the land.
I think we're very optimistic because, when you ask kids whether they're in grade kindergarten to graduation, do you guys know what Lyle Island is? Every single one of those kids, whether they're Haida or not, know the story, right? So it's up to us to make sure that they know the rest of the story. So, that they can feel inspired to, to come work and protect Haida Gwaii. I mean, that's what it's all about.
As a second step, I think we can take a look at the Truth and Reconciliation Report and identify these 94 recommendations and find ways to begin to address them, to take steps to actually improve the conditions that persons have experienced. I've identified some of the key domains within the Truth and Reconciliation Report, including how to improve justice, healthcare, social welfare, education outcomes of Indigenous peoples. So for your tutorial assignment, you can take a look. I'm going to put the slides up going through some of these recommendations, but I also would encourage you to just Google the Truth and Reconciliation Report 2015 and read the report yourself. And whether you look at the report or look at the slides that are to follow, identify one thing or one recommendation and how to go about addressing this recommendation. To earn your participation points cannot just be a superficial recommendation. For example, if the goal is to improve underrepresentation of Indigenous peoples at university, don't just say things like give Indigenous peoples more scholarships. That's great. We should do that, but how are you going to do that? Where's the money going to come from? How are you going to convince the government? How are you going to convince taxpayers to give up this money for these needs? What do we do to get to the point where we can offer a scholarship? So that's everything for this week. Thanks for your attention. Feel free to drop by during office hours if you have any questions or want to discuss these matters any further.